All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing real numbers. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to multiply real numbers, how to deal with multiplication with zero, how to find the reciprocal of a number, also known as the multiplicative inverse, how to divide real numbers, how to deal with division with zero, and then we'll do some more with algebraic expressions and solutions to equations. In general, when we talk about multiplication, it implies repetitive addition. So 3 times 2 is really just telling you to add 2 3 times. 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. So when we're dealing with real numbers, positive and negative numbers, we're going to be doing the same thing, except now we're repeating the addition with a negative number. So 3 times negative 2 will give you negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2, which is negative 6. So when we're multiplying real numbers, remember the following. The product of 2 positive or 2 negative numbers is always positive. So if they have the same sign, if you're multiplying 2 things with the same sign, you're going to wind up with a positive number. The product of a positive number and a negative number is always negative. So more generally, right, if you have an even number or 0 negative signs, then your answer will be positive. If you have an odd number of negative signs, then your answer is going to be negative. So let's try this just a little bit. Negative 7 times 6. Well, 7 times 6 is 42, and we only have one negative sign, and so it's negative 42. Here we have negative 2 times negative 10. 2 times 10 is 20, and we have 2 negative signs, so it's positive 20. And finally, we have negative 2/3 times 4 over 7. 2 times 4 is 8. 7 times 3 is 21. And then we have one negative sign, so it's negative 8 over 21. So when we're dealing with 0, anytime you multiply a number by 0, the answer is 0. Also, if we have a negative included in parentheses with an exponent, then the negative's raised to that power as well. So we have negative 3 squared within the parentheses. The negative 3 is contained in the parentheses. Then that just means negative 3 times negative 3, which will give you positive 9. If the negative's not in the parentheses, then it only appears once. And that minus sign will just be negative 3 times 3. And so that would give you negative 9. There's a very common mistake whenever you're using a calculator. Your calculator will read this as negative 9 and this as positive 9. So make sure when you use it later on in this course, you don't make this mistake. So now let's just practice a little bit of multiplication. Here we have 7 times 0 times negative 6. Well, 7 times 0 is just 0 times negative 6 is just 0. So if there's 0 anywhere in the multiplication, the answer is just 0. Below we have negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 4. Well, negative 2 times negative 3 is positive 6 times negative 4. It's going to give you negative 24. So for the last example, we're just going to multiply these numbers. Negative 9 times negative 2 is positive 18. Negative 1 times negative 5 is positive 5. And 5 times 18 is 90. And so now let's try some examples of exponents. We have negative 2 cubed. Well, that's going to be negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. And then times negative 2 will give you negative 8. For the second example, we have negative 2 times 2 times 2, because the negative is not included in the parentheses. And so again, 2 times 2 times 2 is 8, and we get negative 8. And finally, here at the bottom, negative 1 to the 5th power. Well, that's negative 1 times negative 1 5 times. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. And then times negative 1. And so we'll get negative 1 at the end. So now let's talk a little bit about reciprocals, right? The number 1 is known as the multiplicative identity, right? So you can always multiply by 1 and you'll never change the number. The reciprocal of a number is whatever you would get to multiply, or whatever you would have to multiply by in order to get 1. So if we're dealing with a fraction, you just simply want to flip the fraction over. So for example, 2/3, the reciprocal of 2/3 is 3/2. And if you multiply the 2, you get 1. Only the number 0 does not have a reciprocal. Every other number, you can find the reciprocal. You just want to know what would you multiply by to get 1. So let's practice that just a little bit. For the first example, a is 22. Well, that's not a fraction, but we can write it as a fraction by writing as just 22 over 1. And so the reciprocal, we can be found by just flipping the fraction over. And so that's going to be 1 over 22. Same can be done for the next example, 3 over 16. The reciprocal can just be found by flipping the fraction over. And so it's just 16 over 3. And then finally, for the last example, just flip the fraction over, negative 13 over 9. Notice that when you find reciprocals, the sign stays the same. So now that we can find the reciprocal of a number, we can talk about dividing real numbers. Dividing numbers means to just multiply by the reciprocal. So if we have a divided by b, well, that's just the same thing as a times 1 over b, which is just a over b. Okay, so if you have a problem that looks like the one on the right, where it's just a divided by b, one number divided by the other, then just divide them. Remember that if you have 2 positives or 2 negatives, you'll get a positive answer, and 1 positive and 1 negative, you'll get a negative answer. So let's divide these. Negative 30 divided by negative 10. Well, 30 divided by 10 is just 3. And we have 2 negatives, so it's positive 3. Negative 100 divided by 5. Well, 100 divided by 5 is 20. And we only have 1 negative, so it's negative 20. And then 20 over negative 2. 20 divided by 2 is 10. And we only have 1 negative, so it's negative 10. So anytime 0 is divided by a number, it's always equal to 0. However, if you divide a number by 0, you get an undefined answer. You can't divide by 0. So just remember that as you work through these problems. So now we're going to use what we've learned about numbers to evaluate these expressions and get a solution. We now know how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide real numbers. So we're going to put all those things together along with the order of operations we learned in the last few sections in order to simplify these different expressions. So let's start with that. Remember, we want to multiply before we add or subtract. Negative 4 times negative 11, well, that's positive 44, minus 5 times negative 2, is negative 10. Now we have minus negative 10. That's just going to become plus 10. So the answer is just 54. Now here on the bottom, on the second, on part B, we got to think a little bit more about order of operations here. We want to deal with grouping symbols first, so let's do the numerator and denominator separately, and then we'll divide the answers. So in the numerator, negative 3 squared, well, that's negative 3 times negative 3. And that will give you positive 9. Nine times 2 is 18. And now we have 18 minus 20. We can rewrite that as 18 plus negative 20. And because they have opposite signs, we can subtract the numbers. 20 minus 18 is 2. And we keep the sign of the one with the biggest absolute value, and so that's negative 2. Now we just need to do the same thing for the bottom. The absolute value of negative 5 is just positive 5. Plus 4, well, 5 plus 4 is 9. And so our final answer will just be negative 2 over 9. Let's do a couple more of these. So here we have negative 12 times negative 3 plus 4. Remember, we want to do the numerator and denominator separately. And then we're going to divide what we get. So negative 12 and negative 3, well, that's positive 36 plus 4, which is 40. In the denominator, we have negative 7 minus negative 2. Well, minus negative 2 just means negative 7 plus 2. And now they have opposite signs, so we subtract the numbers. 7 minus 2 is 5. And keep the sign of the one with the biggest absolute value, so that's negative 5. And now finally we can divide. 40 divided by negative 5. It's going to give you negative 8. And finally, for the last example, we have 6 minus 2 times negative 3, and 4 minus 3 times negative 2. So let's multiply first. 6 minus 2 times negative 3. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. 4 minus 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. And so 6 minus negative 6, well, that's 6 plus 6, which is 12. 4 minus negative 6, well, that's 4 plus 6, which is 10. And if we divide both by 2, you get 6 over 5. And so you really have to combine all the ideas that we've learned in the past few sections in order to simplify these expressions. So let's do another example. Now we want to evaluate these expressions using the variables x and y, and we're given what x and y are equal to. Same as the previous examples in the previous sections, but now we just want to use all of our abilities with real numbers. So we're just going to replace the letters with parentheses. And now x is negative 2, y is negative 4, 3 times negative 2 is negative 6, 2 times negative 4 is negative 8. Now we have two negative numbers divided by each other, so our answer is going to be positive. And then we can reduce this fraction by just dividing everything by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. In the next example, we have x minus y over negative x. Once again, just take out the letters and replace it with parentheses. And then plug in the numbers. X is negative 2, and y is negative 4. And so on the top, we have negative 2 minus negative 4. Minus negative 4 is the same thing as negative 2 plus 4. Opposite sign, so we subtract the numbers. 4 minus 2 is 2. Keep the sign of the one with the biggest absolute value, so in this case 4. So it's positive 2. And then minus negative 2, well, that's just positive 2. 2 divided by 2 is just 1. So now finally we want to determine if negative 8 is a solution to this equation. So let's write the equation. X over 4 minus 3. So we've got x plus 3. Now we're going to replace x with parentheses and plug in our number. X is negative 8. So negative 8 on the left-hand side, negative 8 divided by 4 is negative 2 minus 3. Well, negative 2 minus 3 is the same thing as negative 2 plus negative 3. And so that will give us negative 5. On the right-hand side, negative 8 plus 3. They have opposite signs. So we subtract the numbers. 8 minus 5 is 3. Oh, sorry, 8 minus 3 is 5. We keep the sign of the bigger one. And so both sides are equal. And so negative 8 is the solution of that equation. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to multiply and divide real numbers, find the reciprocal of a number, and then evaluate algebraic expressions and determine solutions to equations using all these operations on real numbers.